So I would like to begin by calling this meeting to order through resolution 2024-41. Mover and a seconder, please. Okay. And a seconder. Councilor Morton. And the time is 10:03. Just like to welcome everybody to this training session, and we have our two guests here for Municipal Affairs. We have Kathy Horgan and Sarah Cormier. The camera should look at you, but it didn't. So we'll get you on tape. We have a full complement of council and two members of staff here as well. So welcome everybody. And I guess the next motion is therefore be it resolved, the Council of the Corporation of the Municipality of Calvin hereby accepts and to participate in the training session. I just need a mover and a seconder. Okay, Councillor Grant and Councillor Morgan is seconded. So now therefore be it resolved that the Council of the Corporation of the Municipality of Calvin hereby accepts to participate in a training session led by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. All in favor? And that motion is carried.
Just a note to the offender, Councillor Grant has to leave for an appointment at 11 a.m.
Yes, so I just mentioned to Richard, maybe there's a small recess or something or whatever, but just whenever it's I'm not just gonna get up and leave, whenever we're done a topic or something, we can do that.
All right, so I guess we turn the meeting over to our two presenters.
Thank you very much for having us. I want to thank you for inviting us to offer this training session today. Again, I'd like to introduce myself, Sarah Cormier. I'm a municipal advisor in the Municipal Services Office for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, based out of Sudbury. I'm the municipal advisor for the Nipissing District, so that's why they've had contact with me in the past. They've met you at previous training sessions and that sort of thing. I'm here today with my manager, Kathy Horgan. She's the manager of local government and housing in our office. So the slide deck that we brought today, it's prepared as a companion to the Ontario Municipal Councillors Guide. So it provides a bit of an overview and an orientation to the pieces of legislation and the requirements of the role as a council and as a municipality. So it's not exhaustive. It's not meant to replace any of the provincial legislation, but sort of act as a companion. And I think many of you have probably seen pieces of this deck, and I think I've met some of you in a presentation of this deck in the past. And so I think this is an excellent opportunity for us to look at it with sort of the eyes of being in the chair that you're in and the roles that you're in for the last year and a half, sort of an update to that. So, so it's not, again, intended to replace the provincial legislation, but to sort of add to your toolkit and your resources that you have moving forward. Okay. So, like this. So just a short note at the start that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not here presenting legal advice. You should still seek out legal opinions where you think you need them. This shouldn't be a replacement for any of that advice. We'll start off, and actually this is a slide that has changed since the last time some of you would have met me. So before we begin, I just want to introduce the Honourable Paul Calandra. He is the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. He's also the MVP for Markham-Stouffville, and he was appointed into the position in September of 2023. So that's an update that we'll share. And I briefly alluded to it. The presentation today is based on information you can find in the Ontario Municipal Councillors Guide. It's an excellent resource if you haven't had a chance to look at it online. It takes a lot of really complex concepts and brings them down to really accessible language. Really common issues are highlighted in that guide. So it's available online. I encourage you to go take a look at it. It refers to specific pieces of legislation that will come up in your day-to-day, probably more often than you thought when you first took on the role of councillor. It does change as well. I think we had a brief conversation on the way in with a few folks around. They printed off a copy, or they have a copy from a previous term on council, but it does get updated regularly. So it's a place I would go to take a look for new information as legislation shifts and changes.
If I can add there.
Yep.
The name Counselor's Guide is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not how counselors do their job, it's how councils function, how the municipalities function. So there's information in there about how roles and responsibilities for a head of council as well. And generally how the municipality functions. So the name itself, Municipal Counselor's Guide, is really a municipal council's guide. We will often refer members of the public to it as well. So it helps members of the public better understand how municipalities function and operate. So feel free to, if you have some residents asking questions, feel free to, give them the link and redirect them to the guide as well. So
It's an excellent,
really good information in there.
it's an excellent point because what it does is it usually distills core concepts down to really plain language and everyone's starting from the same page. So we do often use it to direct members of the public. So thank you, Catherine. That's, I had forgotten. And if I'm going too quickly, or if you, have questions, please, feel free to stop me along the way. There's a lot of information in this deck. And so if there's something that jumps out at you, I want you to just from your hand or feel free to step in, okay? So the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, we administer approximately 50 statutes, so 50 pieces of legislation. So, so the core pieces that we work with your council and other councils more regularly, at least here. So the Municipal Act being sort of your primary piece of legislation that guides the work that you do as a council. Certainly the Planning Act as well, that will come up regularly in your day-to-day. The Building Code Act is another one that comes up more often. If you want a more fulsome list, I'm happy to provide that for you. There is, the full 50 wouldn't fit on the slide, and I think you might lose the sort of the core pieces here. So Municipal Elections Act, Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, these are sort of the most common pieces of legislation that we would work with you to the best understand. And this is just a map that shows a bit about who we are, where we are located. So in the Northeast, the area that we're in, we have 110 single-tier municipalities, and our office supports all 110 of these municipalities. We are located in Sudbury, and we are one of 5 ministry offices. There's one in London that covers southwestern Ontario. There's one in Toronto, that's central Ontario, one in the east in Kingston, and one in the northwest in Thunder Bay. So what do we do? Who are we? So we're basically a primary point of contact within the ministry and your portal to other ministries as well. So a lot of questions that I feel on a regular basis from councillors or from members of the public even is, they don't know where to go to access information or a point person at another ministry, for instance, or they have a question that doesn't pertain to the legislation that we administer at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And so they might come to me for that kind of direction to help find where they have to be. So we help to build municipal capacity through providing advice and information. That's on things like elections, on accountability and transparency, specific legislation like the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act being important there. We identify and disseminate best practices. So we're often aware of what other municipalities are doing, similar, they might have a similar bylaw or they've tweaked a bylaw recently. They point you to colleagues for advice in other parts of the Northeast or other parts of the province. We partner with municipalities and others for common goals, right? And we also help to build effective relationships. So I am sort of your primary point of contact in Nipissing District for any of that sort of building or information capacity building stuff. How's my speed?
For me.
Okay. Where are we going to take this next? We're going to start with an overview of the role of council, councillor and staff. We're going to look at some key accountability and transparency issues. We're going to look at meetings and the legislation around that, municipal government, municipal organization, changes to your council composition, your role as lawmakers and exercising municipal powers. And finally, we'll look at sort of the fiscal context of the work that you do as a councillor. jumping right in, we're gonna take a look at the role of council and those head staff. But, can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the key to any organization, government or business or industry is that everyone understands their respective roles and the relationship that you have between those roles, right? And so in the next few slides, we're going to look and review more specifically the role of the head of council, the role of council and the role of the CAO clerk treasurer, and any other discretionary staff positions or statutory staff positions that would be effective in creating effective and efficient local government. The role of council. So in Ontario, councils are required to have a minimum of 5 members, one of whom is the head of council. And the role of council is outlined in section 224 of the Act. And what it states is that council is there to represent the public and consider the.
Sorry.
That's okay. Consider the well-being and interests of the municipality, and that's the municipality as a whole. They are there to develop and evaluate the policies and programs of the municipality. They are there to determine which services the municipality provides. And they are there to ensure that the policies, the practices, and the procedures are in place so that staff can implement the decisions of the council. They're there to ensure accountability and transparency of the operations of the municipality. And that would be also including the senior management, the roles and the work of the senior management at the municipality. They have part of their role is to maintain the financial integrity of the municipality and to carry out the duties, any duties that are under the Municipal Act or any other piece of legislation they're held to. So depending on your municipality, the head of council might have a different title. So some municipalities might call it a reeve, they might call it a mayor. Basically, the head of council, the role is set out in the Act, and they're there to preside over the council meetings so that business can be carried out efficiently. So they are the chair of those meetings. They provide information and recommendations to council with respect to the role of council. They represent the municipality in official functions. So sort of that spokesperson at times for the municipality. And they carry out the duties of the head of council under the Act or any other act. And they act as the chief executive officer. So this is a term I think that sometimes it gets misconstrued, and it's not necessarily intended in the same way that a CEO of a large corporation would, right? So you're not the one making the singular decision that then streams down through the municipality. The CEO is really that spokesperson role in the context of a municipality. So it's a nuance that is actually really important, right? Because the head of council is one member of the council, and so they share the same sort of rights in most instances as the rest of the members of council. So they have one vote on council. They don't have that deciding vote on council and those sorts of things that I think sometimes when we see CEO or the chief executive officer in the language, sometimes those things can get misconstrued, but really they are just that one member of a larger council. Any questions on that?
I have one, just, this is what's going to enrich today is that we do participate and have questions. So please let's everyone participate and have these kinds of questions. When you say there's some often misunderstanding about the role of the head of council, I've heard it said, and we all have heard this said, that head of council is the deciding vote in a tie. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so that sometimes is a carryover from maybe something that's written in your local procedure bylaw or something that dictates how your meetings proceed, that's based in Robert's Rules of Order or based in other sort of procedural guidelines. It's not set out in the Act in a way that dictates when. Act does not dictate when someone on council is expected to vote, like the timing of that vote. So the Act says that every member of council has one vote, and that's what the Act says. It does not say that they cast the deciding or final vote, or that they're to wait and only cast votes on certain issues. In fact, it says that they're expected to vote. They're expected to vote on issues.
And another important point in that they're expected to vote and that they don't only vote when there's a tie.
I think in a lot of cases, in a lot of municipalities, and this is why there's, I think, a misconception out there that the head of council only votes in the event of a tie or doesn't vote at all, is that, as the chair of the meeting, when the chair says, okay, it comes time to vote, the chair will ask, all in favor? They'll look around, you've got 4 members already put up their hand, you know it's a carried vote. And then they still say, okay, all in favor. They don't see any hands, they doesn't see any hands, so it says, okay, carried. So the public viewing that, if the head of council doesn't put up their hand at either in favor or opposed, the public perceives that the head of council didn't vote. You should be careful about what's in your procedural bylaw though, about negative votes. So the act is clear in the event of a closed session, what a negative vote means, but the act is silent on what a negative vote means in an open public meeting. In the open, in a non-recorded vote. So look to your procedural bylaw and see, so if the head of council has never put up their hand to indicate a vote, ask a lawyer, does that then mean that it's a negative vote, right? Because in the event of a recorded vote, an abstention is a negative vote. So you might, if you see 2 in favor, 2 opposed, then the head of council is likely gonna have to put up their hand. I'm in favor, carry, right? And again, that gives a misconception that it's a tie, that they only vote in the event of a tie. But in the event that, it's a non-recorded vote and the head of council sees 4 hands already going up and doesn't indicate, then potentially that may be, the public may think that he voted no against that, right? So just, you might want to talk and look over your procedural bylaw about how best to handle that. But, yeah, it's public perception only. And as Sarah said, every member has 1 vote and is encouraged to vote.
The other distinction, I think, with the term CEO is that it is different than the CAO in the municipality. So the chief administrative officer and the chief executive officer in the municipality are different roles, right? So staff typically take on, and we'll get to that in a bit more detail, but staff typically take on the operational administrative duties of the municipality. And the role of the head of council is set out in section 225, and it specifically says the CEO and not the CAO. And you'll see, I think, as we move forward, that administrative role really does belong somewhere else. So that sort of active, management of administrative duties really does belong somewhere else in the municipality. Yeah.
So I have a question. It just says provide information and recommendations to the council with respect to the role of council. That's a little vague because that could simply mean procedural questions during a meeting, but it also could mean ahead of the meeting, providing information about current affairs that have happened. How are you defining that particular sentence? For example, to make the question clearer, if you have a vote 2-2 and someone says, oh, well, then that's carried, and you say, no, 2 votes for, 2 votes against is not carried, so the resolution does not pass. That's providing information to council. But if at a council meeting you receive a letter from an internet provider that is of great importance to all of the council members, is it the mayor's responsibility or the head of council's responsibility to get that information to council 5 days before? That's what I mean by that. Provide information and recommendations to council with respect to the role of council. So if the role of council is to deal with those kind of issues, then is it not the mayor's responsibility to disseminate that information? Yes.
It's 2 different terms, right? So it's information and recommendations about their roles.
Right.
Not about other things that are going on in the community. In the event that in the example that you provided, if a letter is coming to the municipality that's addressed to the head of council, that's really intended for council. You're the figurehead of the municipality. That's who organizations and the province,
right.
That's who we're going to send a letter to.
Right.
those letters will come into the municipality. You get that information to council through the council agenda. So that's where you would give it over to the clerk or the CAO and the clerk, and they would put it on the council agenda and council would deal with it at the council meeting. What this section means, where it says provide information and recommendations, you need to know what council's role is, exactly what we're describing to you today. So if council has questions about, well, I don't know if it's your role to do this or my role, then you as the figurehead of the community and the head of council would help them better understand their roles and responsibilities.
Sure.
Hopefully that describes the difference.
Yes, well,
Okay,
describes that one.
that one point,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But I think sort of to maybe take a little bit further, which you were saying, so you are going to receive those letters, like sometimes the ministry will even write you a letter that says, you know, Mayor Gould or to the head of council, right, directly. And so I guess it's the process that you use to get that information in front of council, right?
Right.
So your local process
It's through agenda.
is through your agenda, right? So it would usually, in most cases, that information would funnel through the CAO and the clerk, and they would package it up so that it sits well on the agenda and gets appropriately disseminated to the rest of council in that procedure. So the CAO or the staff become that sort of funnel for that information to be sure that it does effectively get to the council, if that makes sense.
And or any other department that it
Sure.
may need to go to, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not intended for the mayor only, even though it's addressed to the mayor,
Yeah.
unless it says otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. Usually anything coming to the head of council, or sorry, yeah, to the head of council is intended that that's coming to the municipality. The head of council is the figurehead. Right? That's who we need to contact.
And as we move forward, I guess in these slides, you're gonna see the staff and the council, whether that's the head of council and the rest of council, they really form those two parts of the municipality, right? So to Kathy's point, that letter essentially is coming to the municipality through you. And then that letter has to flow through the other parts of the municipality to be sure that it's appropriately managed. Yeah, that makes sense.
And just to add a little bit to what Sarah said about the, when she talked about, disseminating the information, and she mentioned the oral processes. We're mentioning that it should be done on an agenda, but you look to your procedure bylaw and if it doesn't say how that kind of information is disseminated to council, then you might want to review your procedure bylaw to make sure that things like that are covered. So again, it's openness, it's transparency, it, explains how to council how they're going to get the information that they need, and it explains to the public how information is disseminated within as well as to staff. So, it's, you develop the local processes for that. Every municipality is going to be different. Municipality I worked in, certain information we had that didn't even go on the council agenda. It was put in their mailboxes for their information only. But we had clear policies that spelled out what type of information fit this category, category B, and category C. And staff ended up following that, but we took our direction from council. Council would be setting those policies and procedures up, setting them out for that kind of information.
So the one danger I see here is that if I should go through my email account, there's probably, I'm gonna say 30 emails a week that come in. And it could be somebody who's selling drones from Africa, and they have a special deal on this week. I mean, to me, it doesn't sound like something that could be to council at this point in time. But then I might get another one from a member of parliament who's doing a special program for homelessness in a riding in southern Ontario, which doesn't and will not affect us here in Calvin Township at all. And then there's another email from somebody who's just talking about a generally wide policy on poverty that's for the entire province. So obviously we couldn't put all of these 30 items per week on a bi-monthly meeting, or we'd be here for 7.5 hours every meeting going through each of these items. So how would you suggest that I disseminate or decide on what information to disseminate to council?
Well, it's not necessarily that it's your decision to disseminate it to council. That's what I'm suggesting, is that council may want to come together to develop a policy on the dissemination and what kind of information should be shared and in what format. So remember that any record even coming to you as the head of council is a record of the municipality,
Right,
not you,
right.
right? So, and it's subject to MFIPA and it's Municipal Freedom and Protection, Information Protection Privacy Act. So remember that, okay? And so what I would suggest, and the example I was giving in the municipality we were with, council said, okay, like your example of a drone coming in or the sale of a drone. That would be information that we would stick in a council member's mailbox. Back then, council members didn't have email addresses.
Right.
So this stuff came into the municipal office addressed to the head of council. We had a process that really came into the clerk. The clerk would take it and that fit the category of that's going in. We don't need to make a decision on it. Council doesn't need to consider this. It's going in for information. And oh, by the way, at the same time, I'm going to give it to the public works, the fire chief, and they're going to get it for their information because who knows when they're the ones in charge of the equipment, responsible for the equipment. They may need it. Then the correspondence that's coming in where another municipality is requesting support for a resolution that they adopted. Well, that's probably something council would want to consider because the head of council doesn't get to make the decision about whether the municipality is going to support something or not. So that would fit another category where that's shared with, sent over to the CAO clerk that says, and your policy would say this kind of correspondence would be put on a council agenda for council's consideration. If it's, the poverty where maybe is AMO sending, out their, their policy position about a certain matter, but they're not necessarily asking for your support, but it's for council's information. Well, that may fit a different category where you may still want to put it on a council agenda, but it's for council's information on the agenda, where you don't necessarily need to consider it at the meeting, but you might want a resolution that says we receive this information or receive this correspondence for our information. But you decide that as a council as to how you want to deal with that correspondence.
And if your inbox is the one that gets the bulk of these emails because you are the head of council, people will find your name first and they'll go to you first. There's nothing stopping you as well from sitting down with staff and saying, okay, I got these 50 emails this week. This is my assessment of them. You would also agree, is this does this one fit with council and these ones, maybe they're not a priority or maybe they're not something that needs to be considered for an agenda, and to work with your staff to maybe read through those things until you have that policy in place. That might be a good way forward until you.
Policy sounds like that's the answer.
So as staff, we deal with it exactly as you. Anything that we receive, we determine whether or not it's good information, if it's junk, good information, or that needs to go, we call it consent agenda for information.
Yep.
And as exactly the motion says, received for their information. And we do provide council with an opportunity to bring that down for consideration.
Exactly.
So we have that on our agenda where we are receiving emails, but this brings up another point though, and that often council members I know receive information from general public that is in their role of council, but that is never shared with us. So what about those when council receives information from citizens in their role, and when does that? Who decides and when and under what circumstances? And I know that you're saying develop policies, but we're here to talk about what should happen with information that they're receiving from residents, no matter what type that information is, in their role as council. So it's not addressed to Dean Grant as the person who plays on the ball team. It's addressed to Dean Grant because they know he's a council member, even though that might go to his personal email.
First, nothing, I would highly recommend what do you mean by personal?
I mean, let's just say somebody in the community knows Dean, they find him on Facebook and his email addresses. I'm sorry, I'm confusing you. Beside me, didn't want to pick on him there.
First, I would hope that you all have email addresses
In the township,
from the township. Okay, and encouraging, when they're on your website, hopefully to advertise to the public. That's the point I wanted to make there. So go ahead.
So this does come up often, especially I think in a small rural community, you often know your neighbor and they might just already have access to you through Facebook, right? So One of the things I've recommended in the past to other municipalities is to have sort of a standard messaging, that a standard communication policy, again, maybe some additional work as well. That says, you know, thank you for your message. Please redirect your message to my official email through the Township of Calvin. So redirect through an official communication channel. And again, sort of like how we're funneling emails from the head of council into different buckets, like maybe that could, the question that comes into for Councillor Grant's Facebook on Saturday morning is my road wasn't cleared in a snowstorm. Can you please deal with that, right? It's not, that's not within the role of an individual councillor to manage the operations, the snow clearing department, but that email or that complaint or whatever it is can be funneled appropriately through the channels that exist in your municipality. So it would be about taking that email and just acknowledging it. I think saying, you know, please use this official email channel, having a policy that states that that's what all members of council will do, and then having the appropriate mechanisms to sort of funnel that once it gets to your official email account.
So can be funneled to the office or should be?
Those are processes, see, the information, and I'm gonna go back to Sarah's first slide about a disclaimer. The information we're providing to you will be, you know, some will be based on, you know, what we see as maybe best practices, but at the end of the day, we're not here telling you what you have to do. Unless, of course, there's specific legislation that says you have to do something. We're here to provide you with what we see as potentially some best practices. But the municipality at the end of the day gets to make the decisions about, our council makes the decisions about how they want that kind of process handled. So Sarah's example of the snow clearing on a Saturday morning, that's a really good example because especially in a ward system where they're automatically going to go to the ward councillor. When really what they should have been doing was logging a complaint through a proper complaints process. If the municipality doesn't have a proper complaints process, then I strongly advise that you do, because if they get complaints, if the Interior Ombudsman gets complaints, first thing they're gonna say is, have you exhausted all complaint mechanisms with the municipality? And if your complaint mechanism is to go to council, that's not really a complaint mechanism.
Right.
So you need a tiered or staggered, escalated process, right? So not that I'm trying to dodge the question about should we, or we're making some suggestions, and at the end of the day, these are council's decisions to make in consultation with staff. So
the other thing, Kathy,
Yeah.
just sort of cut you off. So as we progress, so we've just talked about the role of head of council, right? So
Yeah,
we're gonna look
we're
at the
getting-
role of the council. I think we might be getting sort of the cart before the
Yeah.
horse here a little bit, because I think the important thing to focus on here is like, is it the role of the councillor to triage and manage those administrative issues or those complaints issues? And I think you'll see that it's not their primary responsibility. And so should they be putting a whole lot of time and effort into that? And I mean, you're gonna design your local process how you need to, but you know, once we, I think, go through each of those roles, it will be clearer that that is an administrative role and that there should be a mechanism at the municipality to manage those things, right?
I was bringing it up because it could, and it does happen, you know, to mayor also, where they get those complaints. And, you know, to carry what Kathy said even further, when it does become an issue beyond us and staff isn't aware that a council member might have dealt with something to a personal way because they were approached personally, then Bethel and FIPA comes up, right? And you're subjecting yourself to, and then when staff isn't aware that it's already been done, or there's been some, I would call it interference before it gets to us, and we don't know as staff. And I'm not saying this has happened.
And that's where the proper process,
Right.
proper processes and policies need to be put in place and everyone trained on them and following them.
Because that's what's gonna respect
Yeah.
each of these individual roles. And at the end of the day, each of these individual roles, it's there for a reason, and it's how your municipality is gonna be efficient and effective, right? So everyone playing their specific part, working together, how you're gonna get the good work done. And so a good policy will respect all of those roles, a good procedure will
And
respect
it's
all.
public perception, right?
Yeah.
I think that if council members and the head of council are dealing with the issue, well, then people will continue to go to them and not to the office.
So I'm gonna just move us along to the next, I just want to briefly say, in terms of this, so we've sort of talked about what the the CEO role that's outlined in the act for the head of council is not CEO of a business, and it's also not the same as the CAO role or the chief administrative role at the municipality. So sort of to give a bit of something to go around what that role actually is then. So you're there to uphold, I think the head of council is there to uphold and promote the purposes of the municipality. They might promote public involvement in activities. They may act as a representative within the municipality, maybe with provincial colleagues or even federally if there's an issue in the community. So that's sort of what we mean by figurehead. I don't think we've fully sort of defined that. So I hope that provides a bit more information. And move us along. We have a long deck to get through today, so we're good.
Yes.
So what is the role of the counselor then? So I'm gonna maybe so you can actually see all of the roles of the counselor. The council has several roles, and they actually overlap. So you have both a representative policy making and a stewardship role that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. So we'll skim past this one and we'll go into the actual nuts and bolts of what each of those roles looks like. So you were each elected by your constituents or people in your community to represent their views. So you're going to have many views and many opinions in the community, right, that are going to come your way. You can't possibly represent all of the diverse views. You cannot represent them all at the same time. And I think a former colleague used to say when we get to this slide, if you got into politics and if you were elected to office to make friends, you may have made a horrible, horrible mistake in that process, because that is what you were elected to do. So you need to be looking at issues that come your way and understanding them from sort of a broad standpoint. You need to consider that there will be opposing interests in your community, and you need to be make decisions that will not always be popular to everyone, but they will serve the best interests of the community as a whole. Okay. Anything to add there? No. Your policy-making role. So I think we've sort of already landed on the importance of policies just in our discussion today in this training, right? So policies, they provide the direction for your municipal operations. They establish the general principles that help to guide the actions that you're going to take. So if you have a policy, like we were saying, for managing complaints, right, that's going to guide whether or not the member of council who receives that information feels obligated or feels compelled to actually respond directly, and how they manage that information through. So essentially, the way that policy is made, you start by identifying, well, we have this issue in our community, and then you start saying, well, what is the actual issue? Drill it down to what is actually going on. You're going to agree on the facts. You're going to ensure that you know what the objectives are to sort of addressing that issue. Then council, as a whole, directs staff to research the issue, to identify a path forward and make some recommendations. Okay, so that's a piece that's done. The whole of council would do that. You're going to engage members of the public potentially and hopefully to consider and gain their feedback on a particularly contentious issue, or to be sure that you're understanding how it will impact them. Then you're going to, as a council, review the information that staff provides, and you're going to consider, you know, that's a blue sky thinking, beautiful recommendation, but do we actually have the resources, the time, and how would we actually be able to implement that? Do we have the capacity to actually implement on that staff decision? You're going to collectively, as a council, make a decision based on the best course of action that's available, and you're going to adopt a policy to support that course of action. And then as a council, and not as an individual member of council, you're going to direct staff to implement the policy. And then the part that I think often gets missed, but that's super, super important, is the last one, where you work with staff to evaluate whether or not that policy was working for you. Right? So sometimes a policy that was written in 2004 that you've had forever and it's been working okay is maybe some evaluation or some tweaking, given some new information or new legislative requirements, that kind of stuff. And then you go right back to the beginning of the cycle and you're going to say, well, what's the problem with that policy? How are we going to, or do we agree that this is the actual problem? You're gonna ask staff to find more information, and you're gonna go through that policy making process again. So that's how you're gonna get to that state where you have that good communications policy or that good complaints policy that you might need to work on.
And if I can just add, with respect to the evaluation and, determining whether anything needs to be changed, build a review period into your bylaw and also report back requirements in there from staff. So staff is going to implement the policy as council intended, but it's that feedback from staff back to council that is very important. So as part of the process, as part of your policy, build in those reporting mechanisms back so that council gets the information that they need in order to determine whether or not A, the policies are being implemented as intended, or B, that they are working. And then if you have that periodic or that established review period built in, then you know when they need to come back. Certain policies you probably should be reviewing every 4 years at the beginning of every council term. Procedure bylaw is probably one of them. Section 270 policies is probably another example of some that should be reviewed on a more regular basis. Others, less so. But, again, can't say enough that you can't adopt a policy and stick it on your shelf and never look at it again. Because as Sarah said before, your policies are going to be what helps guide you. It's going to be what helps with openness and transparency along the way.
So council is the sort of chief policy making body of the municipality. So you are responsible for developing or for approving those policies, right? The administration is responsible for carrying out the policy decisions. So staff are the ones who implement the policies. So they're two very distinct roles, but critically important to those policies actually applying and working well in your community. And as Kathy mentioned, that evaluation is critical, and that feedback mechanism or that loop that you build that's, allows staff to say, this is or it isn't working. We've been implementing it for the last 6 months and it's just not flying, or we implemented this 5 years ago. It's time to review it. That mechanism that continues to allow you to update and tweak those policies. It's what's going to strengthen your ability to have good policies moving forward, right?
So item 1, that's identified by staff. And they bring it as a resolution before council to agree on the facts at that point?
Could be staff
Right, staff, it could be members of the public.
No, but what I'm saying is, how does this get into the process? Someone in staff says, okay, we have this policy, but it's not working. Then they introduce it as a resolution to the next council meeting so that in number 2, you can have an agreement on the facts. Is that the process?
So that's a local decision, I would say, like the way that you were identifying. So sometimes I would say issues come from the public. Someone's identified an issue. Mary down the street has identified an issue with the greater timing, the greater garbage pickup or something. They've identified an issue. You're going to agree, yeah, you know what, actually, Mary's got a really good point. So staff and council together, I don't know, it could be staff who identify the issue with garbage pickup time, but you do have to eventually identify together that it is that issue. But I think the way you get there is a local process. You're going to decide what that looks like.
It's going to be a number of ways, right? It's going to be, like Sarah, it could be a member of the public submitting complaints.
Yeah.
So if you have a good complaints policy, as part of that complaints policy, again, there's going to be a report back. So staff are going to report, say on a quarterly basis, we've had 10 complaints about, garbage not being picked up, or we've had 10 complaints that, about a certain policy. Staffers, they're going to put that in the report. They're going to say, you know what? I recommend to council, in order to deal with these reports, let's go back and revisit that policy because I think it's the policy not working. Because on these reports, staff have done what the staff have implemented the policy correctly. We think it's the policy that's not working. So that's one way of bringing something forward for a review. Another way is that a member of the public comes directly to council, which they can, and you bring it back to, you know, through to staff or at a council, meeting, and you say, you know what, I've been receiving, some concerns, or somebody met up with me, and then you would pass a resolution at that meeting to say, we hereby direct staff to conduct a little bit of further investigation in this and look at this policy, and then staff will then come back with a report that says, well, you know, in actuality, here's what happened, and this, everything is fine, our policy is being implemented as possible at this time, we don't recommend any change, or, yeah, you know what, this is a problem for this section of Ms. Black, or of the policy, and here's what I, as a staff person, here's what I recommend to council, how we amend the policy. So again, it can be initiated any number of ways, really.
It's, I think, issue specific and there are local considerations. Yeah,
And then probably there are some issues that could be handled entirely by staff that don't have to go to council.
Exactly.
I mean, if it's, you just mentioned that trash wasn't picked up, and we don't have that here in this township, but
Yeah.
if that were an issue,
Calling.
but here's an issue that might be a council level issue with trash. So are you looking to implement a new recycling system
Right.
broadly across municipality? That might be an issue for council to consider because there may be costs associated with that. And there may be changes to staffing components around that. That may be, you know, does the policy need to be shifted?
but small issues could be handled directly by staff and don't have to be brought back.
That's where the complaints policy comes in, right?
Right.
And setting up and a good communication policy and advertising that to the public, putting it right front and center. If you have, you know, an issue regarding this, here's a form that you can fill out, or here's the phone number that you call.
Have that.
And so, and clearly, you know, and making it clear to the public that this is their first point of contact. Because at the end of the day, like, staff need to be tracking these, and staff then need to be reporting these back to council. Because there could be a policy issue, right, that needs council's consideration. And you want to ensure too, the whole point about a complaints process is that you want to ensure that every member of the public that's filing a complaint is being treated consistently and fairly. And if you have one person going to one council member and then another person going to another one, they may be, you know, dealing with it in different ways. Then you have inconsistent treatment. So if it's always comes into, you know, the nucleus kind of thing, the center, with report back to council, then that in all likelihood will run smoother. And again, part of that openness and transparency and accountability to the public.
Thank you.
But for me, something just got muddy here in this discussion. It sounded like council was still dealing one-on-one with the complaint and deciding whether or not they came forward to council. I don't think that's what's being suggested.
And that's not what we suggested. No, what we're saying is it will happen regardless of what paper,
Make sure that
what
they
you
get-
have in paper. Members of the public, you cannot stop them from going to council, period.
So let's say that.
What
It's
you do
how
when you
council
see it.
deals with.
Right, so like, back
Yeah.
to, let's say Mary does come and say, you know, the garbage is an issue every week, it's picked up late, and so it does sound like it's probably an operational, like administrative issue,
Potentially.
potentially, right? So somebody's identified an issue, maybe it's Mary. Do we agree on the fact? So at that point, you don't maybe need to follow the full policy process here, but if Mary's saying, you know, we really need a better recycling system, we need to, you know, maybe it is a bigger, more policy-based issue, then maybe the example of Mary is a bit clearer there, but it can stop it. No, we don't actually, that's not the mechanism here.
It's where the complaint goes in the end to be
And
dealt
it's,
with.
I think we're focusing more on complaint.
Yeah.
Identifying an issue is identifying something that we need a policy on.
Yeah.
That we've identified something going on in the community. That, you know what, we need to address this in a way and let's develop a policy for it. That's what we're talking, like
Yeah.
big P policy. There's the complaints process, that's gonna be a complaint policy all on its own that isn't gonna follow this. Development of the process or the policy itself, all of that process that's on the slide. But how the complaints are dealt with won't follow that. They'll follow the process that's identified in your policy.
So I can give a real good example if that's okay, so we can differentiate between, because we are focusing on the complaints, because that is what council members traditionally would receive. It's what they do with it that we've covered already. So for example, road use agreements, right? We are receiving road use agreements and, you know, in developing these in conjunction with legal and our planning department, what I've come to recognize is that we really don't have a bylaw that deals with road use agreements. We have a bylaw that deals with roads and seasonal roads and LSR roads, but we have nothing in place that deals with what we've been doing with road use agreements. So there's a recommendation coming forward to council that identifies that as something that's lacking. And this is a recommendation that we go forward to do this, and that.
That would be
A new policy that needs to be developed and a
Yeah.
bylaw, new, because it's missing. And
Yeah.
there's no clear direction to staff in the case of what we have been doing, written anywhere.
And that's often what happens is some issues will come up, you'll deal with them ad hoc, right? On a one-off issue. And then a year from now, you'll see, well, geez, I had that, but how did I handle that? So you're not going to, it may take a couple of years of going through the same thing to determine the need to develop a policy.
Maybe it's not just that one person and then the next person,
Yeah.
you know, maybe you've got 3 complaints or 3, you've dealt with this 4 times.
Let's not
That's
do
where
it.
you're-
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah.
The issue that, right?
Yeah.
You've dealt with the issue 4 different times and then all of a sudden you go, you know what? This is actually more prevalent than we need an actual policy
Yeah.
that's gonna drive how we handle this in the future.
And it's really interesting because staff in the office is new, so when you go back to look at, oh, okay, so how did this happen? What guided the way in this which occurred? And then you go look for the guidance and it's not there.
And it's
So
nothing
that's,
right.
there's nothing
Exactly.
there. So that's when
So
the
this is-
identification of the need
Exactly.
to develop.
Yes.
Yeah, through bylaw.
Yeah.
So policy is separate from bylaw, correct? Policy is the.
Policies are adopted by bylaw.
Policies are adopted by bylaw. So is best practices? Do other municipalities keep a policy book or website or something
It
that?
varies.
It varies, but one good practice that we do see is having key policies at least available on your website so that members of the public are also aware, right? So having them open to the public is, you know, it is something that you get questions a lot about in the municipal office, you know, putting that on your website might be a good way to help answer some of those
And-
questions or create the same level of understanding for everybody. It's about,
And that's what we've been noticing, that, you know, the bylaws that are up on the website aren't typically the ones that, why put every confirmatory bylaw up on your website, but putting, you know, the bylaw for whatever, or, you know, up there that the general public should know about is a good idea.
Well, you raise a good point.
You have a new
Section 5 of the Municipal Act says that councils, or that the decisions of municipality are exercised by council. And then I think 5.3 or 5 sub 3 says, and council exercises its decisions by bylaw. So you exercise your authority, the authority that's given to you under the Municipal Act or any other piece of legislation. You make your decisions by bylaw unless you're specifically authorized to do so by resolution. So that's first and foremost. So you're adopting a policy, that's a bylaw.
Okay.
So you would adopt a bylaw, your bylaw would be simple, 1 pager that says that it'll be a bylaw to adopt the complaints policy. And then down at the bottom, it says that council hereby adopt a complaints policy as shown in Schedule A. And then be hereby, you know, and then you sign it. Your resolutions will adopt that bylaw, but the bylaw then will have the policy attached to it.
As a schedule.
It can be as a schedule, or what some municipalities do is they just make it part of the bylaw. It's your choice.
Right.
But that's a major decision of council that should be adopted by bylaw, that you should have a bylaw to approve that, that policy.
and a little further into the presentation, we are gonna get into the difference between resolutions
Yeah.
and bylaws and sort of the role as a lawmaker and the role that you play the council, so.
I'll go into that.
Sorry, we keep jumping.
No, that's okay, I'm glad the questions are good, but I want to make
You
sure you
gotta
guys.
keep me under control.
Yeah, exactly. Might not do. Okay, so yeah.
One quick question, point 4, at what point of this process, of this, you know, policy issue that's coming to council, point 4, when will we engage members of the public and consider their feedback?
It depends on the issue. I think it's a lot like, the,
I mean, that
depends on
could
the
be,
issue. Sorry,
could that not be as simple as a council meeting open to the public?
Sure.
Right?
It could be.
Engagement.
Not necessarily,
But it-
because you typically, it depends on the kind of meeting.
It
Sure.
depends, right? It
Yeah.
depends on the issue and it depends on, sort of, I guess, where you're at in the process. I think it's hard to answer that.
Yeah,
to be
if
honest.
it's a policy that is going to have significant
Yeah.
impact on the public, I recommend building in public consultation. So it's not just, oh, we're at a meeting and the meeting is open to the public and they could hear what we were talking about. That's not necessarily engagement. That's just you being open and transparent about what you're talking about. But you would build in a public consultation as part of it, where you're specifically holding a meeting where you may have a draft of a policy or bylaw, where you go to the public and you advertise to the public that says, look, we're gonna have a public engagement session about
Garbage pickup.
garbage pickup, where you don't have, we're considering implementing a recycling program. We want your input. Staff are gonna come prepared with, or give council, preparation as far as the cost, how it can be implemented. You're gonna have a presentation like this, and you're going to consult you're gonna obtain the feedback. Good example of this is, a long time ago, council was looking at increasing, the municipality I worked in, we were looking at increasing water fees 275%. 275% of $30. It wasn't a whole lot, but it was a significant financial impact on the rate, right? So, we had discussions. User fees, it's a bylaw, it's a policy, right? Setting a fee, that's a policy. So we built in a public consultation process where we had a meeting, we were like this, I did a presentation as the treasurer, and we had the public ask questions. And then council took that feedback, council went back to future meetings, and then we amended it. So that's an example of where you would build it in. You're not necessarily gonna build it in every policy. And consider the urgency of it too, right? At the beginning of COVID, where you had to amend your procedure bylaw. Well, procedure bylaw is a policy how you're gonna conduct your meetings. You couldn't engage the public, you had to amend that policy quickly, right? There could be emergency situations where you just don't have the time. But depending when there's something that is significantly going to impact the public. Step 4 is something that council should be considering as part of its process.
So I was gonna save this question for later in the presentation, but I'll bring it up right now because it's salient to what we're talking about. I've been through 3 years of council meetings, looking at everyone online, and I see that there's some changes as to how the meetings have been conducted over the years. For the passing of bylaw. And at one time, they used to say, read it first, second, and third time, and passed at this meeting. The only time it was delayed to 2 meetings was very, very, very specific things like zoning bylaws, zoning amendments. But they always read it as, read it first time, read it second time, read it third time. There is the idea that number 4 gets public input, but of course, there can be no public input because they're not allowed to speak at the meeting unless they put in a delegation ahead of time. So the only way that they're going to have that input is if you have a meeting and then you have a second meeting about the same issue. And then they can put in a delegation to make a presentation at that meeting and thereby have their input. So I noticed at one point in time, things were changed from first, second, and third reading to just read a resolution to pass a bylaw, and that was it. And then they had a confirmatory bylaw, which exercised their powers to pass the bylaw in one reading of the resolution. So I'm a little confused because now we do have a confirmatory bylaw. We've gone back to saying first, second, and third, but I think that gives the public the perception that why are they reading the first, second, and third time all at once and just passing it and not allowing us any opportunity to have our input by having a second or a third reading?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's up to the municipality to determine through its procedure bylaw how they're going to adopt their bylaws. Most municipalities that I've seen, they will have 2 resolutions to adopt their bylaws. And most bylaws are adopted at one meeting. There are certain requirements under certain pieces of legislation, like the Drainage Act, that requires
Two readings, yeah.
the 2 readings on 2 separate days. So you read it a first and second time, and then you come back 60 days later after you've held public consultation and you read the bylaw a 3rd time and finally pass it. That bylaw, based on the public consultation, may differ from the first reading. But council's going to determine how they adopt their bylaws, right? So it could be that you're considering a bylaw to borrow some money. You could have one resolution that says that we hereby read this bylaw, or you read it 1, 2, and 3 times, and it's finally passed on this day. Or you could have the 2 different resolutions on the same day, read first and second, and then read 3rd and finally passed. You get to decide how you're going to adopt your bylaws. You also get to decide whether or not there's certain bylaws that you will want to read once, consult the public, come back, make amendments, read a second time. Oh, you know what? Let's go back and consider it. Those are kinds of bylaws maybe where you're implementing, some fines, some bylaw that's going to restrict the public from doing something, where you want to take your time and ensure you're getting it. Not that other bylaws, if you're reading 1 and 2 or both readings or all 3 readings in one meeting, you're not taking your time. But certain ones you might want to take time. You decide that. There is nothing in the municipal act that's going to tell you how to do it. You just get to decide that. The only thing the municipal act says is that council's decisions are by bylaw. Confirmatory bylaws, I'm probably not the right person to ask that. Confirmatory bylaws are really intended kind of as a catch in the event that if you passed a resolution where you should have adopted a bylaw, then some lawyers believe that confirmatory bylaw will kind of protect you in a court if you're ever challenged about you exercising your authority when maybe you should have used a bylaw, if you only used a resolution. That's my interpretation of them. Another lawyer may tell you otherwise. So talk to a lawyer about the use of confirmatory bylaws. They have nothing to do really with the need to adopt that bylaw and the need to, and whether you should have 1, 2, 3 readings in one resolution, 2 resolutions, 3 or 4. That's council's procedure that they're going to set up the procedure.
So when council decided in their procedural bylaw not to say first, second, third, they could do that and just pass it with the resolution to pass the bylaw. Is that what you're saying?
You could, I think it's standard in historical practice to actually say in a resolution or 2 that you're actually reading it 1, 2, 3 times. And then finally passed. I think that's typical historical practice. I don't know what would happen if you said and had a resolution that said that we hereby adopt this bylaw.
Right.
And you didn't say you read it 1, 2, 3 times. I don't know what would happen. You'd have to ask the lawyer.
It's just a matter of perception. It's a matter of sometimes the public sitting there and saying, we read this 1, 2, and 3 times. No, you didn't. You read it once.
Well, and at the end of the day, you're not actually reading the bylaw at the meeting.
Good point.
It's historical practice, I think, but that's probably a better question for a lawyer who can kind of talk to you about if there's been any
Believe it or not,
challenges.
you've answered it. You've answered it. Thank you very much.
And just the final piece, public consultation doesn't necessarily mean in a room. It could be.
Yeah,
provide
you-
written-
council decide.
Yes,
Yes,
electronic.
Sure.
council decides.
There's lots
Yeah,
of different ways to slice it.
exactly.
May I just take a 5-minute recess? And
Sure.
just a very, very short 5-minute recess for everyone, and we'll be right back.
Yeah.
5 minutes. It's 6 minutes after, so.
There's a couple slides I can go over. See if we're later. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get
I
back to
asked you to. If there's any notes
This is
or anything worthwhile to the rest of the training, share with me.
Yeah, I don't think
I think it's gonna be a good set. Oh, it is for.
What do you think it just for council members?
Nice.